For those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Drew Thurman. I'm one of our team members. And if you're still trying to catch on with a little bit of what these monthly gatherings are like, one, you should not expect to hear me very often. We hear from lots of different people from our community. I think this is only like the third time I've spoken in our community's history. So you always hear a wide variety of voices from everyday normal people. And then secondarily, this is just a very small segment of a very larger body of people. We talked a lot about this being a meeting of missionaries where we can bring people together and really talk deeply so that we can go back out and be on mission the rest of the month. So it's a place for us to be encouraged and kind of replenished, compare notes. Even earlier, we had people, I was listening to some of our microchurch leaders compare notes and things that they're learning from one another. So it's a little bit what this space is, but I'm up here this month because we're kicking off a brand new series that we're going to be kind of taking us into early 2023 called A Creative Minority. And I'll just kick us off by sharing a little bit of a story. About 2 months ago, I went back to Indiana, where I had been previously in ministry before this, to preach at the church that had kind of sent me out and speak actually at a week of camp. And it was great. Love those people. They were wonderful to be around. They've been huge support. I was there for 6 years, and just a big part of our family. They've sent us out. They've supported us in a very real way. But I would be honest. I have to be honest in saying that I dealt with some incredible reverse culture shock. I've been here long enough now, going on year 5 in Boston, that going back to the Midwest, to Middle America, I was just kind of shocked. I stayed in a hotel the first night, and I walked around the community and listened to the conversations that were taking place and the things that people were points of contention. When I was at my week of camp, I would drive in every day and work for a few hours at a local coffee shop. And I was just like, I know this is how it was when I lived here, but it didn't feel like it. I was just like, where am I? And a lot of it was, there was this, just in the air, and the culture that was just, we're very against the culture. It was very interesting. Like, everyone seemed to be Christian. I had to remind myself of that. Every day I went into the coffee shop, there was a Christian Bible study that was breaking out in the front. I was like, I don't remember the last time I saw a Bible study in any coffee shop I've been in, but there was a coffee shop. And then afterwards, when they would get done, I would hear them talking together about life, and it was always just like very angry, very against culture, very much like about, against progressive people. It was just like anything they could be against, they were against. I was like, you guys were just talking about sanctification like 5 minutes ago, and now you're very angry. There was an air, there was pride events that were breaking out for the first time in several of the communities, and several of the ministers had written an open letter kind of condemning and saying, this is not God's design. We don't even want to be in the same community with these people. It was just like everywhere I went, there was anger, there was hostility, there was like, we're against the culture. And I was just like, man, it's been a while since I've been here. Then I jump on a plane, and I come back to Boston, and just like remind myself, like we live in a community, we live in a city, and we live in an area now where we're waiting. We're trying to most of the people are we're waiting for culture to catch up to us. We're on the edge. We're on the cutting edge. We're progressive. We're enlightened. We have it all figured out. We just need the rest of society to catch up to where we're at because we have it all figured out. Most of my Christian friends and colleagues that I know since I've even met here, a lot of them have deconstructed their faith. Some for legitimate reasons, but others it's just because it's easier to do. It's difficult being a Christian in this culture, and there's a lot of things like, well, I don't know about that, and I feel like I'm going to be by myself if I stand for that. So I'm just gonna get to go. Or I've got lots of friends that are just giving up a lot of their beliefs that they formerly had because it's just easier to just kind of go with the stream of culture. And I was reminding myself these two extremes that I just been in a 24 hour period. On one hand, we have people that are very we want to control culture. And if we can't control it, we're at conflict, we're at odds with culture. We're constantly kind of posturing ourselves very adversarial against it. And then, I come back to an area that's in many ways just consuming culture and is just being conditioned by culture. And I found myself feeling very lonely. Just as I just like processed the whole experience, I felt very lonely. By the way, I mean, very thankful for Renaissance, and we'll get to that in a second. Like that, there is this community of people that I'm a part of that I'm not alone. But I felt very lonely. Like if these are the two like options, I don't want either one of these. I don't want to be like constantly posturing myself against culture, trying to control it, being angry at it. I don't want to just like let culture just dictate my every move. Why do I have, when it comes to cultural engagement, why are these the only two options? I don't know if you've ever felt that way, but it's just like, yeah, it's like, is there anybody else like me in the world that's like door A and door B? We don't want either one of these. I don't know, but as I processed that experience over the last couple of months, one of the things that I began to realize and began to process through is just this point. We're going to throw it on the screen. Of what if cultural engagement is not a tension to resolve, but one to embrace? Again, I don't know if you feel anything like I do. You feel kind of in the, like, not either one of those options. You like an option C is your thing. Like me, you feel very lonely. And I think one of the things, the more I've been reading and the more I've been studying and kind of renewing some of my interest in some of these issues is, what if cultural engagement is not a tension to resolve, but something to embrace? What if the fact that we do feel lonely, the fact that we do feel a tension, that we are struggling in this moment, what if that's actually the exact place God wants us to be in our current cultural moment? What if God's people have always thrived best in the midst of that tension? I want you to kind of just sit on that for a minute, because this is going to be kind of the thesis that I'm going to be unpacking a little bit tonight. But I want you to just stop there, and I want you to be, you don't have to believe me, but I just want you to sit with it, because that leads us right to the text that we heard read earlier in Jeremiah chapter 29 during our worship set. It's an interesting place for us to be, but it's the exact right place for us to be to answer that question and to wrestle with this. And we heard it read from the Message earlier, so I'm just going to read it again. It's not going to be on the screen, but I'm just going to read it out loud, and I want you to just listen to this with me. The Message, I don't typically read from the Message, but since we were reading from it earlier, it's a modern paraphrase, so it's very easy for us to understand. It says, "This is a letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to what was left of the elders among the exiles, to the priests and the prophets and the exiles, who Nebuchadnezzar had taken into Babylon from Jerusalem, including King Jehoiachin, the queen mother, the government leaders, and all the skilled laborers and craftsmen. This is the message from the God of angel armies, Israel's God, to all the exiles I have taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and make yourself at home. Put in gardens and eat what grows in that country. Marry and have children. Encourage your children to marry and have children so that you'll thrive in that country and not waste away. Make yourself at home there and work for the country's welfare. Pray for Babylon's well-being. If things go well for Babylon, they'll go well for you." Skip down to verse 11. "I'll show up and I'll take care of you as I promised and will bring you back home. I know what I'm doing. I have it all planned out. Plans to take care of you, not to abandon you. Plans to give you the future you hope for. When you call on me, when you come and pray to me, I'll listen. When you come looking for me, you'll find me. Yes, when you get serious about finding me and want it more than anything else, I'll make sure you won't be disappointed." This is God's decree. Now, this is an interesting place for us to find ourselves. I don't know if you've read Jeremiah at all. I wouldn't actually, you shouldn't feel bad if you've not, because it is not a very fun book to read. Most of Jeremiah is pretty angry, pretty just negative. Jeremiah finds himself, he's a prophet of God, he's speaking on behalf of God, speaking some very hard lessons to God's people at a very interesting time in their history. If you know anything about this, at this point in Israel's history, it had been divided into two kingdoms. There was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom had already been conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Let's see if I can get this mic to stay on my ear. But they had already been conquered. He is actually speaking to the southern kingdom about 150 years later, and they multiple times, he's going to predict, they're kind of turning their back on God. Babylon, a different empire, is going to come in multiple times to overthrow the city of Babylon and is going to lead them into exile. They're going to lead them into captivity. They're going to take the best and the brightest from Jerusalem and say, hey, we're going to try to get you to assimilate into our culture. That's what's happening when he writes this letter. Now, you would expect, he's been predicting that this was going to happen. It's already happened by this point in Jeremiah 29. You would think, if you've read the rest of Jeremiah, that this would be the point where Jeremiah would be like, yes, I told you so. I told you this is exactly what was going to happen. And instead, we get a very hope-filled letter, as we just heard. Jeremiah talks to them and he says, hey, even though you're in exile, I want you to know God is still there and he wants you to still thrive and flourish, even though you're at the hands of some captors who you don't like very much. And more than just thriving and flourishing yourself, I want you to seek the thriving and the flourishing of the nation around you, the nation of Babylon. Now, this is shocking for a couple, more reasons than I can count, but 3 major reasons that this is pretty shocking that we would read this at this point. Number 1, at this point in human history, if you got conquered, you kind of ceased to exist, right? It was like a sign that your God or your gods had been defeated, and so you would now, because you lost spiritual power, you had also lost, and you'd lost political power, you had lost cultural power, you had lost economic power. Your gods kind of ceased to exist. You were just going to kind of hinge. You were going to kind of be over with. This is what happened to the northern kingdom. They get conquered, they just kind of get taken over by the Assyrians. We know from history there's lots of people groups, they got conquered and they're just gone. They're wiped off the face of the map. They just get assimilated in. That doesn't happen to God's people. In fact, God's going to send them the message, no, I'm still very much here. I'm still very much in control. You might not think so because you've lost your geographic home, your cultural epicenter. But guess what? I'm still working. I'm still with you. I've not abandoned you. That's shocking. That's the first shock. Number 2, it's shocking because they have access to God without a temple, without priests, without any of the holy things that they've become accustomed to. They become so centered on that I have to go find God in a temple, through the priest, through these religious holy holidays. That's the only time I can find it. And they are actually, God's going to say no, as you just heard at the end, if you seek me, you'll find me. I'm still very much with you. I've not abandoned you, even though that you're in Babylon. I am everywhere. There's nowhere you can go that I am not there. And so I want you to know that you can still discover me, that you can still find me, even in Babylon. It's revolutionary for that. But number 3, and I think this is the most shocking, is that he is not going to just say, you can discover me. He's going to say, I want you to pursue your flourishing in this place that is so against my way of living, so against my character and my virtue, and also bless them as you seek your own well-being. Think about this. If you've read anything about Scripture, Babylon is almost always mentioned as everything God's against. It's almost always forecasted as this nation that is just absent of God's goodness. God's there. And yet, even then, even at the hands of these captors, which if we could talk historically, did awful things to the Israelites, or did despicable things to them, even at their hands, I still want you to flourish and bless them. We live in a culture where Christians want to seek persecution if they have to do anything that's inconvenient, right? We have Christians all the time, wanting to play the persecuted card in our culture, and well, I don't want to do anything that I don't want to do, and still a very, very open democratic society that's very open to our Christian faith. These people are basically being assimilated in. The Babylonians were not interested in their way of life or their faith being continuing, and God says, I still want you to bless and take care of them. This is marvelous. The psalmist in Psalm 137, verse 4 says, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Jeremiah tells them exactly how to do it. In fact, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who just passed away a couple of years ago, an incredible writer, was the first to coin about 15, 20 years ago, writing on this text, that this is what God is speaking about through Jeremiah is a creative minority. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says this was something that had never happened in the history of mankind before this. Jeremiah is speaking something in that would help God's people thrive even when they were not in the majority. And in fact, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks would go on to say that they were better because they weren't in the majority. They're going to be still holding on to God, to their faith, to their way of life, who he's called them to be, and yet be blessing and caring for the wider culture around. That's what this series is all about. Hence why we named it this, based off of Rabbi Jonathan Sack's words. And in fact, the rest of the series, we're not going to get into it tonight, but all the coming months, you're going to be hearing from a number of different voices in the Renaissance family. We're going to be looking actually at the book of Daniel. The first 6 chapters, we're going to be bouncing around. Right as Jeremiah was writing this, Daniel and his friends found themselves in the early days of living in Babylon. They were some of those folks that got taken into captivity, and their names were changed, their cultural customs were being changed, and yet, as we read the first 6 chapters of Daniel, they thrived even in the midst of exile. And so we're going to get really practical in the coming 6 months and saying, what does it look like to live in this tension of not opening door A or door B? What does it actually look like to just live into the midst of the tension? Daniel and his friends are a great example for us, and we're going to be looking at that. And I hope you'll show up and be a part of it. But I just want to make one point tonight to kind of set us all up. Just one application that I think kind of answers that question that's going to help lay kind of the groundwork for everything we're going to hear from the book of Daniel, that I think is going to help you understand it in a way that you've never understood it before. And it actually comes from a book. It was actually got tipped off this last month. I was reading a book from a really deep academic work from a Dutch missiologist by the name of Stefan Paz. And he breaks down this text a lot. He says what's amazing about this text is that there is a priestly quality to it. A priestly quality. In the story of the Old Testament, starting in Exodus, Leviticus, God sets apart some priests, right? They are to be a set-apart people. They are to look different. Their character is supposed to be different than the rest of the nation. But God is doing that for a very real purpose. They are to be distinct. They are to be called out so that they can bless the larger community around them and help them thrive, help them flourish and draw near to God. He says, what's interesting is we come for the first time in God's story, God's people's history, from that point on, they're without priests. They're without a temple. Synagogues actually hadn't been created yet in the Jewish timeline. They're without any of the things they know. And what does Jeremiah actually call them to be? To be the priests. You don't need to wait for anybody to help you. He says, I actually want you to be set apart. I want you to look different. I want you to look distinct in Babylon. And then, out of that, to bless and to seek the flourishing of the larger community around you, the larger nation around you, so that they can draw in to God. Now, why is this important? Why do I point this out? Well, in 1 Peter chapter 2, in the New Testament, the Apostle Peter is going to write to Christians around the Roman Empire at that time, who are being persecuted at the hands of another empire this time, not Babylon, but Rome. Many of them are losing their lives. And if you've read 1 Peter, what does Peter call those Christians around who are dispersed around the empire at the time? He calls them exiles. He calls them strangers. He calls them aliens. Listen to what he says in 1 Peter chapter 2. And see if this doesn't sound familiar and sound all that close to what we just got done reading. But you are the ones chosen by God, Peter says. Chosen for the high calling of priestly work. Chosen to be a holy people, God's instruments to do his work and speak out for him, to tell others of the night and day difference he made for you, from nothing to something, from rejected to accepted. Friends, this world is not your home, so don't make yourselves cozy in it. Don't indulge your ego at the expense of your soul. Live exemplary lives in your neighborhood so that your actions will refute their prejudices. Then they'll be won over to God's side and be there to join in the celebration when he arrives. Make the master proud of you by being good citizens. Respect the authorities, whatever their level. They are God's emissaries for keeping order. It is God's will that by doing good, you might cure the ignorance of the fools who think you're a danger to society. Excuse your freedom by serving God, not by breaking the rules. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Respect the government. You hear what he's saying? We actually talk about this in theological terms, about being a priesthood of all believers. Stefan Paz goes on to say that there is no metaphor that is used more in the Bible to describe how God's people are supposed to act than that of priests. Peter's actually calling these believers around the Roman Empire to the same thing Jeremiah had been calling them to hundreds of years earlier. To be priests. Don't wait. Be set apart. I want you to live differently. I want you to look differently. I don't want you to try to control culture and then can be a conflict with it. I don't want you to just consume and be conditioned by culture. No, I want you to be set apart. And as you're set apart, I want you to bless the larger community around you. I want you to bless your neighbor. And ultimately, I want you to bless the world. I want you to be set apart and seek the flourishing of those around you. That's our role today. Again, what I said from the beginning is this tension that we feel with cultural engagement. Maybe this is something that we're not supposed to resolve. It's just supposed to be embraced. We're supposed to feel that. We're supposed to look different. We're supposed to feel different. We're supposed to not look like anybody else that we run into. And yet, be open-handed that God's goodness and love and grace and mercy should be flowing through us every single day in every interaction. We talk about this. If you've gone through our coaching, I want to give just a real practical view of this. If you've gone through our coaching, you've seen these three graphs. But we talk about this in our microchurch coaching. This is actually backed up by something called social set theory. Christians have often got this wrong, and often our churches have looked like one of the first two options. The first one is bounded set. This is where there's a very strong in and out group. Now you might notice that the center is dotted because often in bounded set models, in social set theory, there's not a strong core. There's not a bunch of strongly held shared beliefs. We're actually seeing this with our political parties that we have right now. If you talk to people who are Democrats or Republicans, there's a lot of things they disagree on. They actually don't have a very hardcore belief. What keeps them together is that they define themselves by who's in and who's out. A lot of the conversation is around where do we set that line of who's actually included in our camp and who's not. How many churches do we know that that's all the conversation? What things are you already doing? Are you behaving in the right way? Let's make sure we set the guidelines in the right place. We're not actually really built that strongly on the gospel or the character of what God's calling us to, but we define ourselves by the out-group. Well, we're not the world. So that's what kind of keeps us together. The problem is, and we don't actually talk about this in the coaching, we need to include this. The response to that, swinging the pendulum, is fuzzy set. I've got a lot of friends that have kind of swung the pendulum the other way. This is where we don't have a strong center of shared beliefs or core values, nor do we have a strong inner out group. There's just a bunch of nebulous lines. And so everybody's kind of free-flowing. And this is why we've got lots of friends that they feel very enlightened and they feel very awesome because this is kind of where they've landed. And yet we know, history kind of shows the groups that kind of do this, they don't last very long. If you can't really define what's holding you together, if you're not really sure what makes you a part of the community or what's not, you just kind of bounce around a lot and it's a lot of chaos. And so this is a lot of my friends, again, that have been just being consumed by culture and conditioned. It's just it's something. I'm not sure what it is, but it's something. What we're ultimately being called to, what we've seen from Jeremiah 29, what we're seeing from 1 Peter chapter 2, is what we call center set. To be a group who is being formed in the crucible of small community. That we have some very shared, poured upon, passionately held beliefs, and particularly about Jesus and who he is and who he's revealed himself to be. And yet we have just a very dotted, very open-handed kind of stance against culture. We're not posing ourselves against culture. We want to bless culture. We want to see culture's flourishing. What holds us together is not trying to decide who's in and who's out. That's on God. What's holding us together is in who God has revealed himself to be. This is what we want to see happen. This is what we believe very deeply. And I think there's a great definition. We're going to throw it up from a guy named John Tyson, who actually did some work based off of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And I think we've adapted it. And this is going to be our working definition of what we want to create a minority to be, to look like this. Is a Christian community in a web of stubbornly committed relationships, knotted together in a living network of persons who are devoted to practicing the way of Jesus together for the renewal of the world. So we want to be a Christian community that's stubbornly committed together because we are formed best. We just got done talking about this in our last series. We're formed best in community, not as solo agents. God does his best discipling work together, and then we're knotted together in a living network. Does this not sound like a micro church connected to a larger network? It does. Who are devoted to practicing the way of Jesus together for the renewal of the world. This is what we're committed to. We want to be formed in the crucible of community. We want to be set apart. We want to look distinct. And yet, we want to bless, be these priests caring for the nourishment of the wider community around us. My prayer is that Renaissance and the movement that continues to kind of form all around our region would live up to this definition, would live up to what we're reading in Jeremiah 29, what we're reading in 1 Peter 2, and we would live up to our calling as priests. Let me pray for that. God, thank you so much for Renaissance, for this community. I'm sure I'm not alone in sometimes feeling lonely, looking around and wondering if the options afforded to me by the church or by the culture that I see around me that's it. And there's some of us, God, I know that you're wanting to do something new in. I think there is a revival of people who want to claim their priestly duties that's bubbling in our region and our country as we realize that you want us to live in the midst of that tension. God, would we just, even in this small group of people, feel permission to walk that line, to not give in to one of the polars or one of the extremes, that we would be a distinct, set-apart people who care deeply for the places we've already been sent, where we live, work, study, play. And God, that there would not be a single person that we run into on a weekly basis who would not taste and see the goodness of your kingdom flowing through us as we interact with him. God, we pray in all things that our city and this region would look more like heaven than earth. We pray this in your name. Amen.